recording the class to our Rambam. We are holding together, Baruch Hashem, with Hashem's help, the 8th chapter of the Rambam of the laws of Mikvaot as we make our way through, right? I believe there are 11 chapters in these halachas, and we, Baruch Hashem, already going through a nice amount of these halachas as we continue to learn about the statuses of what makes a mikvah kosher or not kosher. So you can have a kosher mikvah, which is kosher, has all the 40 saw, all the correct measurements in order to make that mikvah kosher mikvah. And then you might have another thing of water that's not a kosher mikvah. So imagine, let's say somebody had a swimming pool or something. I don't know if this is a perfect analogy. And then there was a mikvah not far away, and they wanted to use their swimming pool, their jacuzzi, as a source of a mikvah. If they is there a way to combine? And we're going to say that there is. Is there a way to combine? If you run a pipe connecting the kosher mikvah to the non-kosher waters, can that turn those non-kosher drawn waters into a mikvah? The answer is yes. The piping will connect the two. Now, there's two kinds of ways a mikvah could be non-kosher. We'll see this later on. It's just an interesting way of understanding it. Either the mikvah could be not kosher because it's drawn water, and we know drawn water is not kosher for a mikvah. And now by connecting your kosher mikvah and the non-kosher mikvah, again, why is the non-kosher mikvah not kosher? It has all the measurements. It has the 40 saw necessary, but it's drawn water. So now by connecting the kosher mikvah of non-drawn water, of rainwater, to the drawn water mikvah, it's simply going to now make the drawn water kosher. And that, by the way, is the standard way almost all mikvahs are made today, is that they have non-kosher water that's in the main mikvah, which means you turn on your hose and now the water is drawn and that fills up the mikvah. And then right next to it is a kosher mikvah, and then those two waters touching, that makes the mikvah kosher. There's another way, which is a little more severe, and that's going to come up a question. What happens if the crevice, the next to the main mikvah, a little further down, is a not just drawn water, but also not enough water for the right amount of water to toivel and to immerse oneself in? So let's say you're using that as an immersion for vessels, and which is probably our most mikvahs today that are vessel toiveling mikvahs. Like if you go to Shalom Torah today and you ever use the dishes one, that thing's probably doesn't have the mem saw, the 40 saw in there. So not just can a kosher mikvah connect to a non-kosher mikvah because of drawn water and make it kosher, but a kosher mikvah can connect to a mikvah not just that has drawn water, but also doesn't have enough, not big enough for a person to toivel in, to immerse himself in, and that'll make that mikvah kosher by being connected to a kosher mikvah. So those are some of the things, and the connection might have to be a little different between those two, but we'll see all these halachas, fascinating halachas in today's mikvah. So let's go. Halacha aleph. Kol ha ma'orav lemikvah, harehu kemikvah umatbilim boy. Any body of water that is in contact with a mikvah, as I started explaining in the introduction to today's class, harehu kemikvah, any body of water that connects to a kosher mikvah, it's considered like the mikvah, and you could immerse yourself, you could immerse your dishes. That cavity of water, that collection of water that's connected, that's not itself kosher mikvah, connects to kosher mikvah, that's kosher. And he's going to give some examples of how these things happen. Gumois asmuchois lefia mikvah. There are these cavities, there are these holes that are nearby the front of the mikvah, the mouth of the mikvah. And how do these cavities happen? And as animals are walking, they step into the ground, just like when we go to the beach and you step on the beach right next to the ocean. You know how you make a hole, all of a sudden water comes up. So it's not directly connected, but nearby. So an animal walks and it creates a cavity in the sand, creates a cavity in the ground, in the mouth, next to a kosher mikvah. And this cavity is now have the mikvah waters, that it's connected to the mikvah waters. If there is a hole as big as a shveiferes hanoid, which is the mouthpiece of a drinking pouch, and we're going to learn in today's Rambam later on exactly how big is the mouthpiece of a drinking pouch. It's 2 fingers that you could turn around. It's like that size mouthpiece. I think it's like 3-4 centimeters. We'll see soon. That you could swivel your fingers around in that mouthpiece, which means basically saying a large enough hole going from the cavity that the animal stepped in, creating a cavity in the ground, but there is a open line of connection of the water between this new cavity that the animal made with its foot and the mikveh waters near it, as long as it has that bond, the mikveh is a kosher mikveh because there is a large enough opening between the two, this cavity, even though it's very small, and you maybe can't even maybe you could just put your fork in there to toivel it to make that kosher to eat from. It's fine, even though it doesn't have the full 40 mem sun necessary for mikveh, because it has an opening the size of a mouthpiece of a pouch, and therefore it's a kosher mikveh. Just to explain a little bit longer so that it'll be easier to move through the halachas later on once we understand the basis in the beginning of this chapter. Halacha number 2. What about holes that are literally right next to the mikveh? I guess when an animal makes a hole, it's not right next to the mikveh. It's a little, maybe a few inches, a little further away from the mikveh. Therefore, you need that connection. But a hole that's literally next to them, right next to the mikveh. Choyre hamara, v'sitke hamara, cavities or crevices of the actual mikveh, and he calls it here, by the way, he calls it here a ma'ara, he calls it here a cave. And the note on the bottom of the Rambam here says, because that, why does he call it a cave? Most of the mikvahs, just interesting, in those days, were built inside caves. So actually, that's why he uses the term cave. I guess they wouldn't build like today in Baruch Hashem HaChabad, they're building this beautiful, fancy, gorgeous building to build our mikveh in. But in those days, they had caves. They would have their mikvahs in caves. So there was a hole right next to the mikveh. It was in a cave, and right next to the mikveh, there was either a crevice or a hole, a cavity. Matvilim behen, you could submerge things in them, in the crevice. Even if there's the tiniest crack, tiniest contact between the mikveh water and the crevice, the cavity that's right next to it, being that it's right next to the mikvah, the littlest kind of crack bonds the two. You don't even need to have it like the mouthpiece of a sack, because that's when it's a little further away, created by animals. But here, literally right next to the mikvah is the crack, and therefore, as long as there's a tiniest crack connecting the two bodies of water, that's considered connected, and that would be a kosher mikvah that you could use to submerge vessels and that are smaller, that are not, if that's not big enough to put a person in there or so. Now he brings a very famous halacha, which when you hear the rabbis in shul, when they want to say a mishnah, we want to add an extra mishnah, we say this halacha. We're going to have 2 halachas today that you'll hear Rabbi Chazanov or the other rabbis in the shul say quickly. This is the law we're going to learn right now. Remember, we're asking if water is not directly in the mikveh, it's still kosher for submerging yourself or submerging your vessels. Someone had a needle that became impure, and he wants to make it pure. Now, maybe he doesn't want to lose his needle. I'm just saying a theory of why he would do that. So he doesn't put the needle in the mikveh because he has to let go. He puts the needle in on the step that's going down to the mikveh. Now, the mikveh doesn't reach there. So how does he get the water on top of the needle? He makes waves. He starts splashing with his hand and pushing the water to go onto the step where the needle's on. It was going on the steps in the mikveh. And he's making the water go back and forth by pushing his hand, making the water, make a little waves. Once the wave passes over it, the needle's kosher tahora, because that wave that you made is connected to the body of water, even though it's going on the step where it perhaps wasn't before. Very interesting. That wave, I saw in the note here, if you threw a very big wave and literally chucked the water out of the mikveh, that might not be kosher. But here he's making regular waves on the top of the head of the water of the top, the tip of the top of the water of the mikveh. That's causing the mikveh to expand and make a wave going over the steps, and that will make the needle on top of the steps kosher. Very interesting. Continuing along with these ideas, we're going to talk about a uka, which is a reservoir under the mikvah. So he has this mikvah, and then he has a floor, and we're going to say, well, how thick is that floor? How strong is that floor? But under that floor is another reservoir of water. So we want to know if the mikvah you built is a kosher mikvah, has a reservoir running under it, how big of a hole does it need between the actual mikvah and the reservoir of water under it to make the reservoir kosher too, that the water in the reservoir should be a kosher mikvah too. Let's see, uka shabateicha mikvah. There's a reservoir of water that's under the mikvah. If the ground, the dirt under the mikvah on top of the reservoir was a very strong kind of earth, and for a long time, that earth is going to stay there. It's a solid piece of earth separating the reservoir and the mikvah on top of it. You need to have the standard hole of shishveres hanod, the 2 fingertips, the the mouth of a drinking pouch, connecting the reservoir to the mikvah in order to make them one mikvah. Otherwise, it's not kosher, because the ground between the reservoir and the mikvah is a very strong, solid ground. So you need a good connection of at least enough space, the mouth that's as thick as the mouthpiece of a drinking pouch, to connect the two mikvahs, just like two cavities that are next to each other. But if the ground is very weak, it's not going to last long. This reservoir and this mikvah is going to become very soon, in a short amount of time, one body of water, because the ground under the mikvah is weak. Even the tiniest connection, the tiniest hole, the tiniest amount of connection between the two waters will make the waters considered connected. I guess because the divider between them is so weak, it's not a good divider. The smallest connection between the two waters will allow the reservoir to become, under the mikvah, to become a kosher mikvah water too, even though it only has a tiny connection, because the thing that's separating the two of them is a very weak separation. Halacha hey. Now we're going to talk about, there was two mikvahs next to each other, and there was a wall between the two mikvahs. Similar story to a reservoir on the bottom. Now we're talking about two bodies of water right next to each other that have a wall between it. And here comes the interesting question: if that wall starts to crack, how big does the crack have to be? And does it make a difference if the crack is horizontal or vertical, allowing the two mikvahs to become connected with each other and become one mikvah? Let's see. If there is a wall between two mikvahs, and it had a crack and it split in two. That split mitzdarfen. The two mikvahs will be combined to each other. So a wall that has a crack between two mikvahs, that crack will allow the two mikvahs to connect and become one together. And if together, because now you have the crack and the two mikvahs next to each other did not have 40 saw on their own, enough water, but because it's cracked and the mikvahs came next to each other, that crack would make the mikvahs one, and therefore, united together between two mikvahs, you have enough rainwater there, and then it's a kosher mikvah. Now that is all that you could have a really thin crack if it's vertical, not if it's horizontal. This is the opinion of the Rambam. The Rambam has an interesting opinion here, that a vertical crack is better than a horizontal crack. What would be the logic behind this to the Rambam? One reason is because a horizontal crack, you still have whatever's under the crack horizontally in the wall is still a good wall. When you have a vertical crack, it's much worse, because now it's straight down the middle of the wall, and the wall can't really be used. It's not considered a perimeter at all. It's not considered a fence at all, because it's cracked down the middle. And there's no real one between the two. So if the crack was vertical, as Rambam was speaking about when he started the halacha, then the Rambam says the tiniest crack will make the two mikvahs connected. If it's horizontal and the crack's not as good of a crack as the vertical crack, it won't be enough to have a thin crack. You'll need to have the mouthpiece of a pouch, of a drinking pouch, which is a thick enough connection to connect the two mikvahs, that if it's horizontal crack, then you can't just be the thinnest crack. It has to have at least the amount where you could stick two fingers through a hole somewhere in order for the crack to be enough of a crack to make the mikvahs one in the case of horizontal. So, and I want to just explain, there's a debate here. I just saw in the notes that there's a debate here between two other opinions, disagree. If a horizontal crack is perhaps better than a vertical crack, unlike what the Rambam said, it's based on the debate and understanding in the Talmud. And the Sifsei Koyin says that we go machmer today. We always say, if you have a crack, we don't care if we don't know which opinion's right. So whether it's horizontal, whether it's vertical, the crack has to be enough. A crack is not enough, just a thin crack is not enough to connect the two mikvahs if there's a wall between them. It needs to actually have the two finger space, whether it's horizontal or whether it's vertical. What happens if the tip of the mikvah started cracking down? So you had a wall, you wanted the two mikvahs separated, but the top of the wall separating the two mikvahs started to crack. And now the waters could reach each other that weren't able to before. I guess the intent originally was that the waters shouldn't be able to touch each other. Now the two waters are touching each other because of the crack. Even if the thinnest amount, he says, like a peel of garlic, a garlic peel, which is very thin, which means a drop of water is getting over the top now, connecting to the other mikvah. So it's a thin layer of water that's getting over from one cavity, from one mikvah to the next, with the space size of a mouthpiece, with the width of at least shveiferes hanod of this mouthpiece of a drinking pouch. It's and then the two mikvahs connect to each other. I think one of the reasons why he wanted to at least be the width of a mouthpiece is because, listen, sometimes dirt could start going over as one mikvah flows into the other one, and then we're afraid that it might stop the flow of water from one mikvah to the next, and meanwhile you're relying on the connection of the two mikvahs to each other. What if something stoppage goes into the top? So he wants it to be at least the thickness of a drinking mouthpiece of a drinking pouch, so the water will continue to flow. But as long as you have that really thin layer of liquid going over between the two mikvahs, that will combine the two mikvahs to each other and make them unkosher mikvah between the two mikvahs together. Over here. Halacha number 6. Let's go on to halacha vav. What is, we keep on talking about, and we've been talking about Rambam, this shveiferes hanod, this mouth of a drinking pouch. And he's going to tell you now what exactly is the size, and it's going to be between 4 and 5.6 centimeters. That is the size of this finger breadth of a large enough, hole that to connect two mikvahs to each other. How much is the measurement of what we keep on saying is a shveiferes hanod, is the mouthpiece of a drinking pouch. It's the width of two fingers. Beinin is medium-sized finger. Beinin is shall call Adam. That's the average size of the person, two regular-sized person fingers that you could spin it around. So it has to be like a circumference of the two fingers. As long as you could get your two fingers in there and turn your fingers around, that means that the hole is big enough to be considered a bond and a connection between the two mikvahs. However, don't use a thumb. The thumb is thicker. We're not talking about fingers, including your thumb size. The two first fingers, that's on the palm of the hand. The first two fingers is the pointing finger and the index, the middle finger, and the pointing finger. Those are the two fingers that are the size that make up that hole that has the right circumference to connect both mikvahs. Anything that will fall into that hole that was made, the mouth of a pouch, anything that went in to create a blocking to that size, will reduce the size, and it won't be considered like you have the correct hole to connect the two waters to each other. And even things that were created from the water. So in other words, I think we're going to talk about it soon, or different, maybe worms or different things that come from the water. It needs to, in order for the two mikvahs to be connected, and one mikvah to kosher another, it needs to have that size of the mouthpiece of a pouch without any blockages in between. It has to be directly flowing one mikvah to the next. The waters have to be directly connecting with each other without any kind of substance blocking in between, in order for the two mikvahs to be considered connected. Now, what happens if you're not sure? What if something was there, or you're not sure it's exactly the right size? What do you do? You're not sure if it's the right size, then we always go stringent. Why not? So the Ram is going to lay down the basics for his understanding of the laws of mikvah. The whole basis for one having to go to the mikvah is biblical, of origin. Now, so going to the mikvah is a biblical mitzvah. You have to go to the mikvah. Woman can't be with her husband, can't eat truma unless they go to the mikvah. That is a biblical commandment in the Torah. And the rule is, whenever there's doubt of something biblical, we always have to go stringent. You could be lenient sometimes in rabbinic cases, but in biblical cases, you can't be lenient. You have to go stringent. Now, but that's true that mikvah is biblical, but who decided that it has to be the mouthpiece of a drinking pouch? Who's the one that decided that? If that's rabbinic origin, maybe we could be lenient in the side. So not biblical, you need a mikvah, but who is the one that decided? So he says, and if the basis of this mitzvah is a biblical mitzvah, you have to go to the mikvah. Even though it's not clearly in the Torah, but it was passed down from Moshe. In other words, we believe that all the measurements, how do we know measurements of things that the Torah doesn't tell us? It was Moses told them originally, passed down from Mount Sinai, what those measurements are. So it's not clearly in the Torah, but it's tradition passed down from Moshe. We always go stringent because since it's a biblical mitzvah, using the mitzvah in its beginning is a biblical mitzvah, we're going to be stringent in this case. Okay, now, halacha zayin. Again, this is one of the most basic laws for how we make mikvahs today. We said that you connect a kosher mikvah to a non-kosher mikvah, and usually what's used? A pipe, a lead pipe or an earthenware pipe, we'll see in a minute, that connects the two mikvahs, and that is how standard mikvahs are today. We fill up the mikvah part where the people actually go into the mikvah with tap water, with hose water, with handled water, and since there's a connection, that mikvah connects to the main mikvah, the mikvah of the rainwater, that's what makes it kosher. He's going to say that here in halacha zayin. You can kosher an upper mikvah from a lower mikvah, which is actually in the Chabad mikvah. One of these, there's a few different rainwater mikvahs, but we have a rainwater mikvah underneath the big mikvah. Even if they're distant from each other, they can be at a very far distance from each other. You can connect mikvahs and make a non-kosher mikvah kosher from being connected to a kosher. In case how is this done? Maybe in Sila, we bring a pipe, either shalcheres, the pipe could be made out of earthenware, or shal avar, or it could be made out of lead, or similar kinds of materials, different kinds of materials. She'ein asiloin is placed on a mikveh because piping will not disqualify a mikveh. Why will piping not disqualify a mikveh? Because piping is not considered a vessel, like we spoke earlier, because the whole point of a pipe is not to be a receptacle to hold the water, it's to let the water go from A to B. So piping is a good way to connect the two mikvahs to each other. What happens is you fill up one of your mikvahs with rainwater, and then you take your hose and you fill up your next water and you cover the hole where the rainwater pipe is going to touch your mikvah that's being filled up with the hose. Now you cover it, you put in your hand, or you put in a blocker, some kind of a thing to stuff the hole. You fill up your mikvah with tap water, with hose water. You pull out the blockage that was there, and now your two mikvahs are connected. Beautiful. And then you intermingle the two waters with each other, and the mikvahs become one mikvah by being connected with each other. You take it and you connect it to two mikvahs to each other. Ke'echad as one. Afilu kisara dayoi. In such a case, even if it's as thin as a hairbreadth, okay, at the point where they became intermingled is only a hairbreadth. The two mikvahs, the piping between the mikvahs touch each other. And the two mikvahs connected with the pipe are considered as one mikvah. Now, just something interesting about the piping, I just want to share that with you, that mikvahs are supposed to be made out of items that are not mekabel tumah, that are not really receptacles to impurity, not to be mekabel tumah. And that's one of the reasons why he says, but you know what? I'm going to skip that actually. I'm not sure. I think that comes later on, something I wanted to say. Halacha ches. Let's go on. Halacha ches. Shalish gumish benachal. Another interesting case connecting two different things. There are three gumos. There are three holes in the ground. Okay, they're cavities, and they're in like a wadi. So when it rains, the rain starts coming down in this wadi, in this like downhill kind of place. And there are three holes in the ground, three big holes in the ground. The middle hole is bigger than the two holes before it and after it. So remember, the rain is coming down, the rain goes into the first hole. That first hole holds 20 saw. Then it goes into the second hole. The second hole holds 40 saw. It's all rainwater. And then the third hole holds another 20 saw. So the top one and the bottom one hold 20 saw. And the middle one is Arbayim, holds 40 saw. Now we know to have a kosher mikvah, it needs to be 40 saw. So the middle mikvah full of rainwater is kosher. The question is the first mikvah and the third mikvah, which only hold 20 saw, kosher? Because since the rainwater is flowing, and the rainwater is flowing through the first, going into the second, and going to the third, is that kosher or not? over b'sayich hanachal, and goes down the wadi as the rain's coming down. Afal pishu nichnas l'sayich, even though the water is going in and out, v'yotzim teichen ein zeiruv, the three mikvahs are not considered a kosher mikvah. And you can't use the top one and the bottom one. Only the middle one could you use it as a mikvah. The only way to get these three mikvahs to connect to each other is if the rain, let's say, it wasn't just because of flowing. In other words, the reason why the three holes are connected is because the rain is flowing with gravity from top down as the rain's coming down the wadi. But if it was all three stood and the rain stopped and the water stood stagnant in one place and it overflowed and all three connected, then it's a kosher mikvah. The only reason it's connected here is because it's flowing down, and flowing water is not a good mikvah unless it's actually a stream that's made to flow is flowing water. In that case, a kosher mikvah. You can only use the middle one because water that flows, does not flow and thereby connect the three mikvahs because it's flowing. That doesn't work for rain. It only works for a stream where naturally it's coming from the original stream where it comes out from and it flows down. Then that flowing water is kosher. But here, using rainwater and turning rainwater into kind of a stream connecting three mikvahs one to another, that does not work. Halacha test. What about where you have mud but soft mud? And he's going to explain how you describe the soft mud. That they're so soft, it's so watery, this mud. That's not congealed, not hard, it's watery. That the cow will see it and lean down and drink from it. He won't say, "Oi, this is earth," he'll think this is as water. That's how liquidy the mud is. And that muddy, liquidy mud is part of a mikvah. It came from rainwater, and it's all rainwater there, but it's muddy. That's a kosher mikvah. That muddiness is thin enough of its mud that you consider that mud to add to the 40 saw making up a mikvah. But if it's very thick, what's the way to describe that it's thick and it's looked at as mud and not as drinking water, that a cow will not lean down to drink them in because its substance is so congealed, so thick? And then that mud cannot be counted as making up the correct amount necessary for making a mikvah. Halacha yud. Continuing along with this muddiness to see where it's kosher for mikvah or not. Mikvah sheyesh be'arbaim samayim. A mikvah had 40 saw of water, kosher rainwater, v'tit, and it also had mud in there. Matpilim b'tit v'mayim. So listen, as long as it's thin mud, you can actually even, and remember we said the mud could be used to make up the mikvah. You can actually go to the mikvah in the mud. But be'ezitit, which kind of mud? Matpilim b'tit harach, only with the soft kind of mud. So you can actually go into a muddy mikvah, as long as it's still very liquidy that an animal would drink from it. Go into that mud and consider like you went to the mikvah, because the water floats on top of that mud. The way you'll get in, the water will get around you, and you'll be fine. But if the water is on one side and the soft mud's on the other side, kind of it's like separated from each other, then you have to make sure to go into the side of the mikvah that's watery and not into the muddy side of the mikvah. Now, I just want to bring the Ramah says that it has to be crushed, and so on. Like we're going to see about this next kind of an interesting case about a fish in the water. Let's see. Any animal that was created from water, they lived their whole life, they're part of water, their creation was fully in water, they're almost considered like water themselves. Like these red worms that come from the water, they grow and they live and they come from the water. It's okay, and the commentary says as long as they're crushed, to be part of the mikveh. In other words, they're not going to be considered maybe separations between you and the water. These animals grew and lived in the water. You could go to the mikvah. I guess they don't have the cleanest mikvah, that they have worms there. It's not a problem. You could go to such kind of water in the mikvah. Or there's a massive fish there and the eye started to decay. And again, you have a mikvah with this eye of a fish there. It can be used as part of the mikvah. It's fine. The animals grew up in the water. They were always part of the water and they're decaying within the water now. And therefore, halachically, it's not a problem for them. The Rambam saying to use that eye or near the eye, in that area doesn't disqualify the mikvah. Halacha Yud Beis, halacha 12. He's going to say a story now where a person had exactly 40 saw in the mikvah, and some water starts going out of the mikvah. So, for example, a guy goes to the mikvah and has exactly 40 saw the measurement for a kosher mikvah, and now he leaves. What happens when a person leaves? They start taking some of the water with him. So we know there's not the full 40 saw. In that case, the second person who goes to the mikvah is not going to a kosher mikvah because the first guy took out some of the water because the mikvah had exactly the right amount necessary for a kosher mikvah. Let's see halacha yud beis. Mikvah sheyesh b'arba'im saw. Mikvah had 40 saw mechuvanis, exactly the measurement of 40 saw. But and two guys went to the mikvah one after another. Even though the first guy, as he's walking out, he's not even out of the mikvah yet. He starts walking out, his feet are still in the mikvah water. The second guy goes to the mikvah while the first guy's feet are still touching it. The first guy is pure, but the second guy is impure. Why? Because the mikvah is lacking the 40 saw necessary. The first guy took out of it. And as some of the commentaries explain, I know he might have water in his hair, but there's parts of his body that's dry. So the water that his feet are in are not touching the water on his head. It's considered totally separated from the person. It's not in the person, it's outside the person. And therefore, being that the first guy's feet are still in the mikvah water, it doesn't help. His hair is wet. It's totally separated from the mikvah. It doesn't help that his feet are in the water. And the second guy, there's not enough water now for the second guy in the mikvah, and therefore the second guy his tefillah, his immersion in the mikvah doesn't count. However, hitbila by tchila sagais ave, they put in the mikvah a thick sponge or the like, and they started lifting it out. If some of that sponge is still touching the water, the second guy goes to the mikvah, he's fine. It's not like the guy who's, let's say, here is wet and that's totally separated from the rest of the mikvah. The sponge water, the water in the sponge is literally, the sponge is still touching the mikvah. All the water in the sponge is connected to the mikvah, because all the waters are connected, and therefore the second guy went to the mikvah is kosher. Now he's going to bring another case which we also talk about when we say Mishnayos, right? Before Kaddish, we also bring this Mishnah too that the Rambam is discussing. Hitul bayis hamita. You might even recognize the words. Somebody wanted to put a bed in the mikvah. Hitul bayis hamita. They stuck a bed in the mikvah. Now beds, if you ever carry it, it's a problem. If you ever try to schlep it through your house, they have feet sticking out. It's hard. So the mikvah might not. They wanted to submerge the bed, and the bed has to be fully submerged as one in the mikvah. So maybe they take it to this kind of lake that's a kosher mikvah. But the legs, it's a shallow water, so they have to push the legs down into the mud under it. So now the question will be, the legs are going to be in the mud is now stuck to the legs, the bed might not be considered fully submerged in the mikvah. Let's see, someone submerged the bed in the mikvah, even though they're pushing down the bed, that the legs, so the top of the bed should fit, they need to push the legs down into the mud, and it's thick mud. Shabakarka that's in the ground, because it's in the bottom of the lake, they got to push it down. Shabakarka mikvah that's in the ground, the mikvah should safu amayim aleho l'mayla in order, because why they pushed the bed down? Because they wanted to get the water to cover the top of the bed. The bed is good. Why? The legs are in the mud. Because the legs, before they got pushed into the mud, first went through the water. And I guess as it's making the cavity in the ground, the first thing it touches is the liquid, is the water. So the bed is considered, because as it creates, I guess, the cavity in the mud of the ground, there's still water there being created in the cavity it's creating in the ground. And now the bed is considered fully submerged. What happens if you put a big pot in a mikvah? And I think we're talking about a mikvah that is exactly 40 saw. The pot is going to be non-kosher. Why? So the pot, if you ever try to stick the backside of a pot, big giant pot, in a thing of water, if the water has exactly 40 saw, everyone knows it's going to splash, and the water from the mikvah is going to sprinkle out, and you won't have the 40 saw that was exactly in this mikvah before. Kate said, yes, so what should you do? So he's telling you exactly how to table these big pots of water shouldn't splash. You put it down by the opening of the pot, where it's open. In the mikvah, you turn it around, the mikvah, matpila, and you let it go in the mikvah. You're allowed to be submerged in the mikvah. When you pull it out, I guess don't pull it out, the giant pot with its handles, put it back upside down, and then pull it out from the backside of the pot. Because if you pull it out straight forward, now that whole giant pot that's full of water is going to be considered handled water. And as you're going to pour that water back into the mikvah, it'll disqualify your mikvah, because as you pull it out, the mikvah goes lower than 40 saw. And then when you throw the water in the pot back in the mikvah, it's going to make it handled water, and it's not going to be a kosher mikvah. So turn it around, make it upside down, let the water go out as you pull the pot out, and you shouldn't have an issue. Finally, halachi zayin. What do you do? And this is also, we read this in the Mishnayos always when we say before we say a Kaddish. What happens if you have 40 saw in the mikvah, but the way your mikvah is shaped, it's very, very, very thin, and a guy can't lay down and fit in it. So it has the right measurement, but spread over how wide it's dispersed over too wide of an area that he can't get his body into the whole time. So he needs to figure out a way to do it. So what's a simple way to make the water, in more of one area? Throw in bundles of stuff, and that will make the water, in other words, the extra space where the bottom of the mikvah is too wide, and now the mikvah is going to become narrower. The water will start to rise, and you'll be able to fit inside the water. So mikvah shemeimu murdadim, a mikvah whose waters were dispersed. Koivish afilu chavili kash, you could press, throw in there even bundles of straw, chavili kanim, or bundles of reeds. Throw it into the water. That'll cause the water table to rise. And you put it on the two sides of the mikvah until the water level rises. And then you can go into the water. Now it's high enough for you to squeeze and fit inside. You can go into the water and fit inside in that mikvah. Now, one of the commentaries say, why did he specifically use examples of reeds and straw? So that's what I started saying before. I meant it over here. I was really supposed to say it over here, that really mikvahs are supposed to be made out of things that are not receptacle to impurity. And being that branches and reeds are not receptacles to impurity, that's why he suggests to do it with such kind of a thing. But don't use vessels. Don't start using pots and pans to raise your water level, because you're going to use the pots and pans to create your mikvah, and your mikvah is going to be made kosher through things that are receptacle to impurity. We don't want you making a mikvah out of such items. And one more thing, another commentary explains that also reeds and bundles of straw and reeds have a lot of gaps in between them, and that gives you enough of a gap, like a like the mouth to a drinking pouch, and that would allow the water to flow through so they don't become a problem. And that, my friends, is the end of today's Rambam.